year. I hope. But guess we're able to start the offering around this morning. Chris, would you help us out this morning? I don't have my. Maybe that's why we wanted to move it back. They don't get all in to take the offering. We'll have to move farther back next time. Thank you. Beautiful. I would say springtime day out there. It's not quite springtime, it's according to the calendar, but things are growing. My wife was out doing her butterfly book yesterday. Took 2 years, and it's finally looking like it's going to take off this year on its own. The last 2 years she's planted it, and had to go all the way back to the bottom and start from the roots up. It just did not come back alive. So this year looks like it's going to do it. So she was out trimming it yesterday. When she starts working in the flower garden, I know spring is here. It's a good day to be out.
So it's good to see everyone out this morning. And as we always do, let's ask the Lord's help in our class before we begin. Are there any questions you'd like to mention? I will mention Arthur. We do need to keep remembering him. And I understand, at least I don't know if it was positive diagnosis or test, but he thinks he may have COVID again. So it seems like things like this go around, and he's just in a weak condition. He gets everything. So let's remember him. Are there any other requests that you'd like to remember this morning?
Ephraim Stokes was goes in Columbia Church. He's taken to Hershey, very serious matter.
Okay.
For him, pray.
All right. All right.
Found out the test I had to take for ServSafe is actually going to be opened up, so that kind of relieves some pressure. But
Yeah. All right. I know the feeling it relieves pressure. We were under pressure to get a job done. Boy, does it feel good when you can see the end and you've made it. Minutes to spare. That's literally what it was. So yes, I've been under pressure before too for other reasons with my job, and it's always nice. It just, what a sense of relief when it works out better than you thought. So, yeah. All right, Scott, would you ask the Lord's help in our class this morning, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for all that you've done, who you are. Thank you for your love and mercy. We ask that you bless this time of Sunday school, Lord. Help us draw close to you, understand your word better, glorify you, and we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, our lesson is titled The Son of God on Trial, and coming up with the Easter season here. So a very fitting lesson. The key verse is, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. Now this lesson is certainly about the kangaroo court and the sham trial that took place on the eve of the crucifixion. But you know, there's an irony about trials. Those who sit in the place of the power, in the place of power as judge, often fail to take this into account. In every trial that's ever taken place, there are two cases being tried: the defendant and the judge. You think, well, the judge sits in the place of power. Well, the accused is tried in the courts of earth, but the trial of the judge is more serious than the accused. We've had some pretty serious trials over the last few years, but that judge sits in a very serious place. Every time a judge passes sentence, he's tried in the courts of a just God. In America, we're supposed to be guaranteed equal justice under law. We've heard that phrase a lot here in the last few years. If there ever was such a day, that day is long gone. The enemies of this country are afraid of a man. They're afraid of a man by the name of Donald J. Trump. Now, he's no saint, and this isn't a political speech this morning. In fact, there are a lot of things I don't like about Donald J. Trump. He probably wouldn't be my first choice. He may be yours. That's fine. He may not be my first choice. But the enemies of this country are afraid of that man. His policies have pulled the cover off their evil designs. We now see who they really are, what they really intend. They don't have your best interest in view. His enemies have dug up all the dirt they can find. They've twisted every law they can twist. They've brought slanderous charges and ensnared him in costly legal battles with the hope of destroying him. Next presidential election. They've already successfully pronounced judgment against him and levied astronomical penalties and fines in an attempt to bankrupt him. As large as those penalties seem, they're small compared to the sentence against those trying him. Their trial is of more consequence, and it's far more serious than the trial of a man they have accused. There are governors, district attorneys, and judges who will be found guilty in the courts of heaven because of their hatred and injustice. So running parallel to this lesson about the trial of Jesus is the fact that while the religious leaders who were full of blind hatred have brought Jesus to trial in a sham court, God was trying their case in the only court that matters. It really doesn't matter what the opinions of the courts of earth are if you're clear in heaven. In Matthew 17, God spake from heaven. He said this of Jesus, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him." So then everyone who hears the gospel stands in the court with Jesus on trial. They're either by actions or words on the side of those who slander the Son of God, or they stand with Jesus, and they take the slander and abuse right along with him. So as our lesson opens, Judas has come with a mob and authority from the high priest to arrest Jesus and bring him to trial. Now, there's a couple of verses before our lesson that we need to bring in here just to set the scene. And those are Matthew 26, 55 and 56. It reads this way, "In the same hour said Jesus to the multitudes, Are you come out as against a thief with swords and staves for to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you took no hold on me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled." And the next verse says, "And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled." Now John's gospel tells us they took him to Annas first. John says this, "And led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year." Now that may seem a little strange, but under Roman rule, the position of high priest was appointed by the Roman governor. The position was a political position. We tend to think of those high priests as religiously appointed. When we read through the scriptures, we don't think of these things. The position was a political position. Annas had been high priest for 9 years. 5 sons followed him in succession. Now his son-in-law is the high priest. So apparently Annas was still very influential and held the reins behind the scenes. We know how that goes, don't we? There's somebody holding the reins behind the scenes in the highest places in our government today. I'm not sure who it is, but somebody's holding the reins behind the scenes. Well, here's Annas. He's pulling the same thing. He was consulted first. Well, after he had consulted him and examined him, he sent him bound to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, to be tried by the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body of the Jews. That body consisted of 71 members of scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and elders. Under Roman rule, the Jews didn't have authority to put a man to death. All they could do was examine the victim, he was a victim, examine the defendant, and recommend the sentence to the Roman governor. The Roman governor had final authority. So while their authority has been limited, the Jews were still bound to follow the Mosaic law in religious proceedings. The Jews violated their own laws in this trial. There were several of them they violated, but a couple of them were these. A verdict could only be reached on the day of the trial if the verdict was not guilty. Otherwise, it had to go, at least go overnight. You couldn't pronounce a man guilty on the same day of his trial. Witnesses were to be examined separately and to have no contact with each other. So the whole proceeding is highly illegal. Now we might wonder how the high priest could be so unjust. Well, there's a history. The Talmud tells us that the high priests of that day were despicable men and accused of luxurious living, moral corruption, and perverted judgment. Those were the high priests. Those sit at the highest places in the church of the day. Is it any wonder that Jesus didn't get a fair trial? Everything he taught was according to truth and righteousness. Everything he stood for contradicted their lives. These men were interested only in their position in the world. Now, isn't it amazing what a little self-importance will do to a man or woman? In the world, sadly, in the church. There may be a certain amount of importance that comes with a position, but it belongs to the position, not the man. When the judge removes his robe, he is now a private citizen. When the president steps down and another man takes his place, he is now a private citizen. The importance belongs to the position, but these men have taken the importance to themselves. Self-importance will take what was once a little boy or girl full of childish innocence and make them into someone who would do anything to hold on to their place of power and importance. And again, as we look at our political world, I look at some of those people and I think, at one time, they were a little child running around playing imaginary games. Look at them today. That's what self-importance will do to a person. A little self-importance will take a good man who should stand up for truth and make him silent to protect his place or his career or his position or his wealth. How many times in the workplace do men who should stand up for those who are being mistreated just step back and be silent because they don't want to jeopardize their position, their place? There were men on that Sanhedrin court who, if they were there, should have been protesting loudly. Instead, they followed the perversion of justice. It's the same story over and over. We have a little position, we recognize things aren't right, but we just keep our heads down, fail to register a protest when an injustice is done. We want to be part of the group. We fear being outnumbered or any other number of reasons. So this sets the stage then for the trial that takes place in our lesson today. It's a highly illegal court, men full of self-importance, and they hate a man. First we see, though, one of Jesus' most faithful followers allowing his fear to overcome his love. The next verse tells us of Peter. His failure wasn't final. His failure was due to human weakness, not the rejection of truth. So we can have a little mercy on Peter. The next verse reads, "But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end." Now, there have been a lot of sermons about Peter following afar off. Some of them have been highly critical of Peter. Well, in defense of Peter, in the scenes of life, he was no coward. Peter had more physical courage than most, probably more courage than you or I. To put this in perspective, when a politically motivated FBI shows up in force at the house and they bust down doors and charge in with weapons drawn, yelling for everyone to get on the floor, would you draw your sword? When they haul your friend off to jail and to a sham trial, how closely are you going to follow? There's deep fear when that happens. When the mob showed up, the disciples knew exactly what and who they were dealing with. We read through these stories, and we just read right over them. But sometimes it helps us to put ourselves in the setting. The disciples knew what and who they were dealing with. They were dealing with corruption at the highest levels without a conservative Supreme Court to back them up. We read through these scenes as if they took place calmly. We read through that, and we seem to think everybody just stood there while all this happened. Well, it wasn't two parties having a discourse and then Jesus surrendering. The scene was wild and chaotic. The entire night was violent and chaotic. Judas identifies Jesus with the kiss of betrayal. Jesus asks who they're looking for. They answer, Jesus of Nazareth. He answers, I am he. Such was the power of his words that they went backward and fell to the ground. Such was the power of evil in them, they got up and took him anyway. Peter was a man of instant action. And like Moses, he thought the time to fight had come. He draws a sword and swings at Malchus, a servant of the high priest. And of course, Malchus obviously moves in self-defense, and Peter cuts his ear off. Fortunately for Peter and Malchus. Blood is now running profusely. This is the scene. Jesus says, stand down, Peter. Peter was taken aback when Jesus said, stand down. Peter's ready to fight. Now just put yourself in your manhood shoes, defending someone rightfully, and then look at Peter. Everything was surreal. He could hardly believe what was happening. This is taking place at night. That makes things more surreal. And then when Jesus is taken, all the disciples were in great fear, and considering discretion the better part of valor, they fled. Well, we can't win this one. Let's get out of here. I think what we need to understand about Peter is he still trusted in himself. In the moment, he would have fought to the death. But when Jesus said, stand down, he was completely disarmed. He was not a traitor, only human, and depending on his own human strength, he failed. A man needs more than physical courage. He needs moral fortitude that only comes from God. That's the issue here. Peter wasn't a traitor. Peter hadn't thrown the truth over. Peter was a man of truth. This is human weakness. You can be sure your cocksure attitude will land you in the same trouble Peter was in. Just be certain of it. Peter now crept along behind, sneaked in, and blended with the crowd in the back of the court to see the end. The important question is, where would you follow? We just said the FBI came busting down the door, guns drawn, yelling for everybody to get on the floor. They jerked your best friend out of the room. Where would you follow? Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. He's now in the palace of Caiaphas, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. And at last came 2 false witnesses. Now the shocking thing about this court, the verdict was already in. The sentence had already been passed. Matthew tells us of a meeting that had taken place earlier. Matthew 26:3 reads this way, Then assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. The sentence is already passed. They just needed to find an accusation that would stick. Matthew says they sought false testimony against Jesus. The meaning is they kept on seeking. They just couldn't find anybody. I don't know how many doors they knocked on. I don't know how many people they contacted, but they were desperate to find somebody. And they just kept on looking. They were going to find somebody, somewhere. He was not leaving this court without a guilty verdict. What they were really doing is looking for someone to slander his good name. They finally found 2 witnesses who at least misrepresented the same event. Mark tells us they couldn't even satisfactorily agree. He said, but neither so did their witness agree together. But what they said was, this fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. That is not what he said. Jesus had gone into the temple just before the Passover, not long after the beginning of his ministry, and he witnessed the irreverent disregard for the house of God. It was to be a place of prayer. Religious words were worthless in that place unless preceded by a sacrifice that was acceptable to God. When the sacrifice was made in God's way, it ascended as a prayer to God. In the name of religion, they had turned a quiet place of prayer into a noisy place of commerce, which it was never intended to be. No doubt they put a fancy spin on what they were doing. Probably was the ministry of sacrifice or something. They were selling lambs and changing money. But it was nothing more than the world in the church. Jesus drove out those who profaned his Father's house, and the Jews were upset. John gives us the account. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou dost these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days a sign to look for. He didn't say he would destroy the temple of God. In fact, he didn't say he would destroy any temple. He said, you destroy. Or we could say, if you destroy this temple, meaning his body, I'll raise it up in 3 days. They may have misunderstood him then, but they misquoted him now. The high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is that which these witness against thee? Now, have you ever noticed, when evil men want to condemn an innocent man, they often, if not always, put on a great show of being law-abiding and righteous. When we look at the sham trials going on in our nation today, it's under the guise of righteousness. It's under the guise of being law-abiding. Well, these priests are no different. He arises in indignation at the report insinuating Jesus said he would destroy the holy temple of God. There's a little more that goes along with that. If that were the case, that would amount to insurrection, and he would be liable to the Roman government. So the high priest is looking for anything to pin on him. Well, Jesus embodied the truth. Those trying Jesus were not interested in the truth. There was no point in trying to defend himself. They wouldn't hear his side anyway. The high priest was not interested in truth. The outcome has already been determined. They have their man now. They just have to find the crime. When you find yourself in a court like that, you're in a bad place. So the next verse reads, But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Isaiah has this to say about Jesus holding his peace. He said, He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He knew what they were doing. He could have put them to silence, as he had done many times before. Instead, he was silent. Now, just a little side note here. We may get the idea that we shouldn't defend ourselves when we read this account. That we shouldn't defend ourselves when we're unjustly accused. From a civil standpoint, it was not wrong for Jesus to defend himself. From a moral standpoint, it would not have been wrong for Jesus to answer his accusers. He chose to be silent. He chose to let them carry on with his sham trial. He allowed them to convict him. They thought they were in control. They weren't. He was in control. So Barnes says this, he was brought as a lamb to the slaughter. This does not mean that he was led to the slaughter as a lamb is, but the picture is as a lamb which is led to be killed is patient and silent. The lamb just follows along. So was Jesus. He made no resistance. He uttered no complaint. He suffered himself to be led quietly to the cross. He would not plead his own case, but he would plead yours. Pulpit Commentary says this, the high priest now addresses Jesus officially as a minister of Jehovah, puts him under an oath to make an answer. To such an adjuration, a reply was absolutely necessary. The law held a man guilty who kept silence under these circumstances. So Jesus was required to answer, and this time he answers. Robertson said, Caiaphas puts Jesus on oath in order to make him incriminate himself, a thing unlawful in Jewish jurisprudence. Caiaphas, pretending to uphold the law, broke the law in an attempt to get Jesus to speak words that would condemn him. So Jesus answered him, Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, when Jesus said, Thou hast said, he wasn't saying, well, you said it. He was giving his assent or affirming the truth that he was the Christ. That was just another way of saying, that's true. What he is saying is, Thou hast said the truth. We could substitute the word furthermore for the word nevertheless to make the meaning more clear in the rest of the verse in the next words that Jesus spake. It would read this way, Furthermore, ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Jesus affirms he is the Messiah, and then he says they would see him sitting on the right hand of power. Now, sitting on the right hand of power denotes majesty and dignity. It's the highest place of honor. So here's Jesus, a simple rabbi, bound before them, saying, you're going to see me sitting in the chief place one of these days. Finally, he tells Caiaphas you'd see him coming in the clouds of heaven. Barnes says this, the meaning is this, you shall see the sign from heaven which you have so often demanded. Remember, throughout Jesus' ministry, they kept asking him for a sign. Just what sign do you give us? Now, we think, well, a sign, he just healed a man. Isn't that a sign? Well, there are a lot of people healed. There were a lot of healings in Israel. Other prophets have healed people. Other prophets raised people from the dead. They were looking for a sign that said, this is the Messiah, and Jesus gave them the sign of truth. And then he said, you'll see me coming in the clouds of heaven. This is the sign. So this is the sign they'd been asking for. He said, you'll see the sign, which you've often demanded, even the Messiah himself returning as the sign with great glory to destroy your city and to judge the world. This is quite a scene. Here's the humble rabbi who to all apparent indications is helplessly bound as their prisoner, telling the judge that one day he, the prisoner, will sit in the highest place of honor and return to be the judge of the judge. At this point, the trial has taken a strange twist. Caiaphas thought Jesus was on trial, but now it's Caiaphas on trial. Jesus has given him an opportunity to embrace the truth. Now, we know Caiaphas is a hardened man. He's not going to. But Jesus has told him one more time, I am the Messiah, and I will come back. I will be sitting in the highest places of honor. This factual statement that he was the Messiah had saved a woman at a well. It had made a blind man to see, both physically and spiritually. It had raised Lazarus from the dead. The evidence was conclusive that Jesus was who he said he was. Caiaphas made a fatal mistake. He's not interested in evidence. He's interested in a conviction. He did not realize he was about to condemn himself. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. Prosecuting attorneys are known for their theatrics and oratory in order to get a guilty conviction from a jury. Not too long ago, within the last couple of years, there was a prominent South Carolina lawyer by the name of Alex Murdaugh who was convicted of murdering his wife and son. He may have, but the prosecution had only circumstantial evidence. Now, if you paid attention to it, I paid pretty close attention to it in the news. They kept making him look very bad, but I kept listening to the expert witnesses and then the cross-examinations. As bad as it looked for Murdaugh, much of the evidence was still inconclusive and in dispute. Two high-powered attorneys went head-to-head in that trial. The defense disputed the evidence. Murdaugh was not squeaky clean in the rest of his life. So the prosecuting attorney painted Murdaugh as a liar, a thief, and a drug addict. He'd been addicted to painkillers. So he was. He is a liar, a thief, and a drug addict. Therefore, he is a murderer as well. He painted him as a low-life character, and therefore he is a murderer as well. That's basically the argument. Now, he didn't say it that way, but the way he with the theatrics and oratory. That's what he said. That's what he did. That's the picture. His argument was emotional. The jury convicted him. In theory, our judicial system was designed to let a guilty man go free rather than condemn the innocent. But prosecuting attorneys don't play by those rules. Now here we have Jesus under prosecution. The high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of any witnesses?" Well, the high priest outdoes them all. Tearing one's clothes was a sign of great grief. This man, full of blind hatred, pretends to be overcome with grief at the blasphemy against God. I think it was Ben Franklin who said, "The worst wheel of the cart makes the most noise." Well, here's the worst wheel of the cart, and he's sure making a lot of noise right now. He tears his clothes. He pretends to be on fire with holy zeal for God, when in reality he's a lying murderer scheming to get rid of the competition. That's what's going on here. The high priest claimed to have his evidence now that Jesus was an impostor and a blasphemer. In reality, he ignored all evidence. He was not interested in evidence. He had his conviction. Now, there's quite a contrast here in people. On this side is Jesus, calm, quiet, and unassuming. On the other side is the influential high priest, impressive, important, and loud. Who would you listen to? These are the scenes of Jesus' trial. This is bringing it down to real life today. Who would you listen to? Well, so many times we listen to the one who's loud and impressive, don't we? Jesus is calm, quiet, and unassuming. The high priest says, "What think ye?" They answered and said, "He's guilty of death." They thought they were sealing his fate. They were sealing their own. They would hear those very words, "guilty of death," as they condemned Jesus, playing over and over again in their minds when it came, when it came their time to stand before God. Guilty of death. Guilty of death. Light had shone into their lives. They chose darkness rather than light. Truth had been presented to them. They rejected it. Now they're no longer capable of recognizing truth. And then they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee?" First, we had a pretense of righteous indignation. Now the mask comes off. There's no pretense of righteousness. These men have become unhinged. They're religious men. The respected religious leaders of God's chosen people acted like madmen in the presence of God's Son. This is disgusting, shameful, vile, and despicable behavior coming from grown men. It indicated the highest form of contempt they could possibly show to Jesus. The words buffeted mean to strike with the closed fist. So Jesus is sitting here. He's going through all of this sham trial. Now they're spitting on him and hitting him with their fist. Those who struck him with the palms of their hands likely struck him in the mouth in pretended abhorrence of the things he had just spoken. This is the trial of Jesus. Now, hopefully we've gotten some feel for the chaotic violence of the whole scene. Jesus went through that for you and for me. He wouldn't defend himself, but he would defend you and me. We know the Romans scourged Jesus, but the fact of the matter is he was beaten up before he ever got to the Romans. He was in bad shape before he ever got to the Romans. The religious Jews beat him up first. What has happened? Well, here's the thing. When men deliberately reject truth, they go down. Always. People can go a long time through life without making any decisions. They can live a long time, pretty good life. But when they come face to face with truth, and they have to make a decision, when they reject truth, they go down. Sometimes fast. These men went down. They rejected truth. If you want to see what this looks like, look no further than the political arena of our day. There are men who we thought once stood for conservative values and principles who are now on the other side because they're eaten alive by hatred of a man. What happened? They went down. They wouldn't stand for what was right because they hated a man, and they went down. Some of them are so unhinged you can see it in their faces. It's a particular a person on one of the news sites that if you look at his face, he's unhinged, and he spouts nothing but lies. They now deliberately take the truth and flip the narrative, calling good evil and evil good. At one time, one of these men even served as a conservative in our Congress. He's now unhinged, and he went down. Why? Somewhere he came face to face with the truth. He refused to stand on the side of truth. That's what he did. He refused to stand on the side of truth, and he went down. We may think the Christian church is exempt from these kinds of men and this kind of behavior. There's no denomination or church that's exempt. When a man rejects truth, when he finally comes to that point and he rejects truth, he goes down. Entirely new churches have had their foundation laid in the bitterness of those who started them. There have been a lot of churches started, some in this area, and they were started by bitter people. What happened? They rejected truth and they went down. Oh, they're still playing church, but they're down. Jesus suffered this sham trial and the vile abuse so that he could plead your cause. It's now your turn to decide. Will you try to blend in like Peter? Will you openly bitterly defy him like the high priest and the Sanhedrin, or will you step over to his side and stand with him? The trial of Jesus has gone on through the centuries in the hearts of all who've heard the gospel. You can stand with Jesus or condemn him like Caiaphas. If you believe he is who he says he is, then you have a choice to make. If you really believe he's who he says he is, then you have a choice to make. You can take him now as your Savior, or you'll have him as your judge. To stand with him, you may have to take the same abuse. The blows meant for him will fall on you. But Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven." So in our lesson today, Jesus was rejected by the very men who should have welcomed him. Our key verse says, "He came unto his own received him not." The fate of those men has been forever decided. The question today is, do you receive him? Thank you very much for your attention. We'll stand and we'll be dismissed for the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come,
Thy will be done, on earth as it is